Chapter 1. The Medal in the Glass Case. It was on a damp London afternoon that I accompanied Hercule Poirot to Ashdown Hall, the country seat of Sir Lionel Ashbury, a retired soldier of uncommon pride and increasingly brittle temper. The sky had been threatening rain since noon without ever quite resolving to honesty, and the roads beyond the town shone with that cold, resigned wetness peculiar to the English countryside when it has decided to endure discomfort rather than protest. Poirot, who disliked moisture unless it presented itself in a basin, a bath, or a cup of chocolate, regarded the weather with tidy hostility and arranged his cuffs twice before we had passed the second milestone. The invitation had come from Sir Lionel himself in a letter composed in a hand at once disciplined and irritated. A public ceremony was to be held the following day for the local historical society, before which a distinguished family relic was to be formally unveiled. A silver campaign medal awarded to Sir Lionel's late father, General Sir Matthew Ashbury, for gallantry in an imperial action many decades earlier. Sir Lionel wrote that an act of contempt had been committed against the object, and that because the matter involved family honor, public impression, and a household not yet prepared to invite ordinary police enthusiasm, he desired Poirot's discreet assistance. Poirot had accepted at once. "A medal, Hastings," he said as we travelled, "is never only metal in such a house. It is a sermon cast in silver. It says to the living, remember properly, admire correctly, and do not embarrass the dead." Ashdown Hall stood at the end of a long avenue of beech trees which had already surrendered most of their leaves to the season. It was a broad, pale house, Georgian in front and more confused in its additions behind, with that unmistakable air of having been improved by generations of men who valued continuity above beauty and authority above comfort. The gravel before the entrance had been newly raked, the steps were spotless, the windows shone, yet for all that obvious order, one felt as soon as the motor stopped that the house was not at ease. It wore tidiness the way some people wear politeness, because something less manageable waits immediately beneath it. A butler of military correctness admitted us and led us at once to the morning room. It was there that I first saw the medal. The room itself was pleasant enough in intention. Long windows looking over the south lawn, pale floral curtains, small polished tables, and chairs designed for afternoon conversation rather than domestic crisis. But all such softness was abolished by the object at its center. A glass display case stood upon a dark wood pedestal between the windows and the fireplace, and within it, suspended against a square of deep blue velvet, hung the medal that had summoned us there. I saw at once what had disturbed the household. Its silver face, once bright and carefully kept, had blackened in irregular patches. The crest engraved upon it was dulled beneath a crusting film. The ribbon from which it hung drooped with a neglected look, though nothing else in the case appeared disordered. It was not the noble dimness of age, but the ugly staining of affront. The object seemed less like an honored relic than a thing deliberately humiliated. Sir Lionel Ashbury stood before it with clenched jaw, and that expression one sometimes sees in aging men of authority when outrage has become too habitual to be theatrical. He was tall, white-haired, erect despite the years, and still unmistakably military in bearing. His face had once been handsome and was now reduced to its discipline, narrow, lined, and made more severe by the refusal to concede frailty. One understood at once that he had spent a lifetime commanding men and had found retirement less an ending than an injury. "It was polished last week," he said. "My father's medal was never left in such a condition. Someone has done this, deliberately." Poirot leaned forward, his head a little to one side, his eyes half closed. "Then," he murmured, "we are not dealing only with silver, but with sentiment. One does not tarnish a medal merely to spoil metal. One does it to wound memory." Sir Lionel made a short, hard movement with one hand. "Exactly." It was then that I understood what Poirot had grasped at once. The object itself was not the true target. The medal had merely been chosen because of what it represented: honor, inheritance, and an old family pride that had begun, perhaps long ago, to curdle into grievance. Sir Lionel introduced the household with an economy of courtesy, suggesting that domestic affection had never been one of his principal interests. There was his elder son, Philip Ashbury, a grave man of about 40, with a face shaped by duty and disappointment in nearly equal measure. He had the look of one who had spent many years trying to be exactly what was expected of him and had not yet received the promised peace in return. There was the younger son, Julian, handsome, easier in manner, and too quick with the smile by which charming men so often hope to pass as harmless. Lady Margaret Ashbury, Sir Lionel's widowed sister, sat near the fire in grey silk and perfect composure, with that mild outward softness under which old women of intelligence conceal a prodigious capacity for observation. Miss Eleanor Vane, a niece by marriage, had lately come to Ashdown Hall to catalogue the family papers for the Historical Society. She was dark, self-contained, and plainly clever, with an expression that suggested she respected the household only in limited installments. Last of all stood Dr. Henry Lorne, the family physician and long-time friend, a quiet man of perhaps 50, with the attentive voice of one used to mediating between pride and weakness. Poirot asked first, not who had access to the case, but who knew the medal would be publicly displayed. "Everyone," said Sir Lionel. "Ah," said Poirot softly, "then already the audience exists." That answer seemed to irritate Sir Lionel, who wanted, I think, an outrage simpler than the one beginning, to form. He produced a key from his waistcoat chain and unlocked the display with a sharp movement. "I have kept this myself. No servant touches the case." Poirot examined the interior with great care. He did not at first touch the medal itself. Instead, he inspected the brass fittings, the velvet backing, the hinges, the inner edge of the glass, and even the polished wood below the lock. Then, using a folded handkerchief, he gently touched one of the blackened patches and looked at the faint residue left on the cloth. "Not mere neglect," he said. "Something has been applied." Philip stepped closer. "A chemical? Possibly. Or something from ordinary domestic life used with intelligence," Julian said lightly from the hearth. "A malicious intelligence, one would think." Poirot turned and looked at him. "Malice is rarely intelligent for long, but injury often is." The younger man's smile altered without disappearing. It was the first of several small adjustments I saw him make that afternoon whenever family feeling came too near being named. Poirot then asked the history of the display. The medal had usually been kept in Sir Lionel's private study. Miss Vane, in preparing materials for the society, suggested it be placed in the morning room where the letters and dispatches relating to General Ashbury's career could also be arranged. Sir Lionel agreed. The case had been installed 3 days earlier. The medal was bright then. On the second evening, Miss Vane noticed a slight dimming. By this morning, the discoloration had become unmistakable. "And who," asked Poirot, "was in this room during those 3 days?" The answers came quickly enough, but with interesting differences of tone. Miss Vane had worked there daily upon the papers. Philip had assisted with the arrangement of the display. Sir Lionel came and went. Julian had looked in now and then. Lady Margaret had sat there yesterday afternoon for nearly an hour. Dr. Lorne had visited Sir Lionel and once paused to examine the medal. The servants dusted the room, but, as Sir Lionel repeated, did not touch the case. "In houses," said Poirot mildly, "it is always useful to distinguish between what servants are told not to do and what they are physically unable to do." Sir Lionel looked at him sharply. "I am not a fool, Monsieur Poirot." "No," said Poirot. "That is what makes this so interesting." Dinner that evening confirmed what the medal had already suggested. The object stood at the centre not of family pride alone, but of family pressure. Sir Lionel referred to his father, General Ashbury, not as one remembers the dead with tenderness, but as one invokes an enduring authority. Philip received such references with the strained seriousness of a man who has long lived under comparison. Julian met them with light irreverence, too practiced to be entirely spontaneous. Lady Margaret watched everyone. Eleanor Vane said little, but missed nothing. Dr. Lorne intervened once or twice with the soothing skill of an old physician who has learned to lower domestic fevers before they become public. The first open crack came over one of the display letters. Miss A. Vane had selected for reading at the ceremony the original commendation for bravery. Julian, glancing through the typed program, said, "One would think grandfather conquered the empire personally." Philip looked up at once. "He earned what he received. I do not deny it. I only question whether the county of Ashdown requires so much instructional reverence before tea." Sir Lionel's face hardened. "Your grandfather had the distinction of substance. You have, at present, only opinions." That landed more heavily than the words themselves explained. Julian smiled, but badly now. "Perhaps," he said, "I inherited the wrong century." Lady Margaret said quietly, "Or merely the right impatience." No one answered that. After dinner, Poirot spoke first with Miss Vane in the morning room itself. She was intelligent, and better still, exact. She told him she had indeed been the first to suggest the display, not from sentiment, but from historical usefulness. The Ashbury papers, she said, were more revealing than the family cared to admit. In what way? She glanced toward the closed door. General Ashbury was certainly brave. He was also ambitious, vain, and much concerned with how actions would later appear in print. Some of the letters are less noble than the family legend. "Did you tell Sir Lionel this?" "I showed him one letter I thought unsuitable for exhibition. He said it was private and irrelevant." "Who else saw it?" "Philip, Dr. Lorne, possibly Julian, though he pretended indifference." Poirot nodded. "And the medal. Do you think its tarnishing was meant as insult to the general?" "No," she said after a moment. "I think it was meant as insult to Sir Lionel." That was acute and likely true. Philip, questioned next, proved what he appeared: dutiful, honourable, and unhappy. He did not deny reverence for his grandfather, but objected to the ceremony itself. "My father has made a theatre of remembrance," he said quietly. "He thinks honour is preserved by display. I think it is preserved better by silence." "Yet you assisted with the arrangement." "Yes, because refusing would only have produced a different kind of scene. That, too, was illuminating." Philip was a man who obeyed not from conviction, but from exhaustion at the consequences of resistance. "And your brother?" At that a shadow crossed his face. "Julian dislikes being measured against dead men." "Only dead ones?" "He dislikes being measured at all." Dr. Lorne, when his turn came, was more cautious. He admitted the household had become strained in recent months. Sir Lionel's health, though not alarming, had made him more controlling. The question of the future management of the estate had become difficult. Philip, as elder son, expected responsibility. Julian, being dependent on allowances and vague financial rescues, resented anything that sounded like moral instruction from the family purse. Lady Margaret sought peace. Miss Vane, by introducing papers and history into the centre of the house, had unwittingly stirred sediment better left undisturbed. "And the medal?" asked Poirot. The doctor's hands moved lightly over his knees. "A symbolic act." "By whom?" "If I knew, I should have said so." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, doctor. If you knew, you might first have decided whether it was healthier not to say." That answer struck home more than the doctor liked. By the time we retired for the night, the case had already altered in my mind. The Tarnished Medal was not a prank, and not mere vandalism. It was a gesture aimed through an object toward a living person. One does not choose the family relic of a military father at the precise moment before public display unless one understands the family mythology and wishes to touch it where it bruises. As Poirot stood by the fire in our room, arranging his brushes, in order before bed, I said, "You think one of the sons did it?" He considered, then shook his head. "I think one of the sons may wish us to think that of the other." "It is not the same thing." "You mean the medal is only the beginning?" "My dear Hastings, the medal is the announcement. The true matter lies beneath it, where all family matters lie. In pride, money, old comparison, and the stories by which one generation keeps the next obedient. He lifted one finger. And there is something else. Miss Vane said the wrong letter was found among the papers. That means history itself has begun to misbehave in the house. When the dead cease to support the living narrative, then people become inventive. He was right. I felt it already. The silver in the glass case had blackened, yes, but what truly disturbed Ashdown Hall was not the medal's condition. It was the possibility that someone in the house had finally tired of honor as an instrument and chosen, in the smallest yet most public way possible, to wound the memory by which Sir Lionel governed them all. Chapter 2. The House of Quiet. Quarrel's Ashdown Hall contained all the elements of domestic unease. That was my first settled impression after an hour beneath its roof. The house itself was large without grandeur, comfortable without kindness, and ordered with the sort of scrupulous care that often means not peace, but strain successfully concealed. There are homes in which objects appear to have found their natural place through long use. At Ashdown Hall, every table, lamp, framed portrait and coal scuttle seemed rather to have been instructed where to stand, and to remain there under penalty of displeasure. One felt at once the presence of discipline, and just beneath it, the pressure of lives adapted to discipline for too many years. Sir Lionel Ashbury lived there with his daughter Clara, a sensible young woman of calm manner and good self-command. His nephew Edwin Marsh, who managed certain estate accounts and was spoken of as indispensable by those who plainly did not trust him. Mrs. Briar, the housekeeper, who had served the family for 20 years and wore loyalty the way other women wear mourning, and Thomas Reed, the gardener's son, now employed as a general attendant and known locally, so the butler informed us, for intelligence beyond his station and reserve beyond his years. There was also Mr. Julian Pike, the family solicitor, who had come from London on matters connected with the ceremony, and one suspected, with other arrangements less publicly announced. The effect of these persons assembled under one roof was not harmony. It was pressure. I observed before dinner that the household moved with the forced civility of persons living atop an old argument. Clara spoke gently to her father, but he answered with abrupt impatience, as though gentleness itself had become an accusation. Edwin smiled too readily and laughed a shade too loudly, which is often the social disguise worn by dependence when it wishes to appear equal to its circumstances. Mrs. Briar, while outwardly no more than a faultless housekeeper, kept a close watch upon everything and everyone, including, I thought, matters that did not properly concern a servant. As for Thomas Reed, he carried himself with an independence that sat oddly beside his station. He moved correctly, but not submissively. One felt that if he served, he did so by decision rather than by nature. Poirot noticed all this, of course, before I did. "A family," he said softly, as we stood for a moment in the hall before dinner was announced, "is like a locked room, Hastings. The air in it becomes stale, and every little action means more than in the outside world." That was exactly it. The medal in the glass case had been tarnished, yes, but one had only to look at Ashdown Hall to see that the insult did not stand alone. It had attached itself at once to tensions already waiting for use. Sir Lionel received us in the drawing-room before the gong, and if his manner had softened at all since our arrival, it had done so only into a stiffer variety of resolve. He had clearly determined that whatever private agitation the incident caused, no public retreat from the ceremony would be permitted. "The medal remains on display," he said. "I will not be made ridiculous by some petty malice." Clara, seated not far from the fire, lowered her gaze at that. Edwin, standing with one elbow against the mantel, fingered the stem of his wine-glass and smiled in a way that seemed intended to suggest agreement while really revealing discomfort. Julian Pike, who had arrived only shortly before our appearance, adjusted his cuffs and said nothing at all. No one contradicted Sir Lionel. Yet the silence which followed possessed a peculiar weight. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of those who knew the matter of the medal belonged to something older, darker, and not yet paid for. The dinner table clarified matters further. Sir Lionel sat at the head with the medal, though absent from the room, governing. The meal almost as effectively as if it had hung above the sideboard. Clara, on his right, did her best to preserve ease by the intelligent management of conversation. Yet every topic she introduced seemed, after a few sentences, either to die of caution or to stumble unexpectedly toward the family past. Edwin Marsh spoke often and with studied brightness, but no bright manner can wholly conceal the watchfulness of a man who measures every word for its effect. Julian Pike, by contrast, spoke rarely. He was a narrow, polished man of perhaps 50, with the composed economy of a solicitor who has spent his life listening to anxieties disguised as instructions. He had the sort of face that reveals little because it has been trained to record, rather than respond. Mrs. Briar did not, of course, dine with the family, but her presence was felt all the same. One saw it in the exactitude of service, in the timing of dishes, and in the manner by which the servants entered and withdrew under a discipline too old to be merely professional. Thomas Reed alone among them suggested something less inherited. He moved quietly, but with a self-possession unusual in one of his position. Once, when Sir Lionel addressed him sharply over a matter of wine, he bowed at once and corrected the error. Yet his face, for the briefest instant, did not assume the blank apology one expects. It hardened. Poirot saw it. So did Clara. That interested me more than the incident itself. The first real fracture came over a trivial question of the Historical Society's programme. Mr. Pike remarked with professional caution that perhaps the reference to General Ashbury's unsullied legacy might be softened given the unfortunate condition of the medal. Sir Lionel turned upon him with sudden contempt. "The legacy is unsullied," he said. "If the silver is stained, then it is the work of some cowardly hand, not any." Reflection upon my father. Pike inclined his head. "Naturally, I spoke only of wording. You solicitors always do. That might have been let pass." But Edwin, perhaps from nervousness, perhaps from foolishness, laughed. The sound was slight. The effect was not, "Sir." Lionel's eyes moved to him. "You find this amusing?" "No, no," said Edwin quickly. "Only the way Pike retreats before a phrase. He would redraft the 10 Commandments if they seemed litigious." No one smiled. Clara said quietly, "Edwin." He fell silent at once, but I had already seen enough. The household did not merely fear Sir Lionel's temper, it had formed around it. After dinner, Poirot asked, as naturally as if inquiring after, the weather, that each member of the household describe his relation to the medal. Such a question, put abruptly, often yields more than a chain of deliberate ones. Sir Lionel, hearing of the request, approved it with grim satisfaction. "Excellent. Let us hear who values the thing and who does not." Clara answered first. She said she valued it as one values any object into which too much family feeling has been poured. Carefully but with caution. It had belonged to her grandfather. It meant much to her father. And she had grown up understanding that certain moods in the house moved around it. "That is a curious answer," said Poirot. "It is an accurate one," she replied. "I liked her better for that." Edwin Marsh declared warmly that the medal was the crown of the Ashbury tradition, and that he could not imagine any decent person laying a finger upon it. The warmth was excessive. Poirot, who distrusts enthusiasm in domestic settings unless it is attached to dogs or plum pudding, merely bowed. Julian Pike said that professionally he preferred documents to relics, but acknowledged the medal's historical value and had advised that it be properly insured during the display. That, too, was interesting. A solicitor who thinks first of insurance may still be honest, but he is never sentimental. Thomas Reed, when finally asked, answered after the briefest hesitation, "It is a fine object, sir, but objects depend on what people make them mean." Sir Lionel stared at him. "That is an unusual observation from you." Thomas lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." No more was said. Yet the remark remained in the room like a draught no one wished to acknowledge. Later, in the privacy of our room, I said to Poirot, "You think the gardener's son impertinent?" "No," said Poirot. I think him educated by life in ways Sir Lionel has not noticed. Such men are dangerous only when others force them to understand how much they see. And Edwin? Ah, Edwin smiles too much. A man who smiles too, much before a family relic has been insulted, either hides anxiety or rehearses innocence. And Clara? At that Poirot took some time before answering. She is the only one in the house who speaks naturally against the pressure of the others. That does not make her innocent, but it makes her interesting. The next morning brought little outward change and much inward confirmation. Sir Lionel doubled down on dignity. The medal remained in its case. Clara moved through the house with the same calm efficiency, though I noticed twice that she paused before entering the morning room, as if bracing herself for more than the sight of blackened silver. Edwin took it upon himself to mention before everyone that he had balanced the estate accounts late into the night, a statement which no one had asked to hear, and which therefore instantly seemed suspicious. Mr. Pike requested a private conversation with Sir Lionel, and received it behind closed doors. Mrs. Briar hovered at a distance from all this, with the watchfulness of a jailer who has long ago ceased to think of keys as objects. Poirot spent the greater part of the morning not with the medal, but with the people. That is his great gift, though the world insists on praising instead his little grey cells, as if they performed their miracles in a vacuum. In truth, he understands people with a precision more exact than logic alone can achieve. He knows how guilt breathes, how resentment performs civility, how dependence jokes, and how old service becomes possessive. At Ashdown Hall, he used that knowledge not theatrically, but patiently. He began with Mrs. Briar. She received him in the housekeeper's room, where linen lists, polished keys, and domestic authority were arranged with almost ecclesiastical order. Her face, broad and stern, did not encourage intimacy. "You have served the family 20 years, said Poirot. "Yes, sir." "You were here under General Ashbury?" "No, sir. Only under Sir Lionel." "And you care for the medal?" "I care for what belongs to the house?" "Which is not always the same thing." She met that without flinching. "No, sir, but often near enough." Poirot asked then who among the family might wish to strike at Sir Lionel through his father's memory. Mrs. Briar answered with immediate propriety that she could not imagine such wickedness under that roof. Yet the answer itself was too swift and too finished. "You have imagined it," said Poirot softly. "You merely dislike the thought." That produced the first true pause. "At times," she admitted at last, "there has been friction." "About money?" "Among other things." "Mr. Edwin?" She tightened the lips. "Mr. Edwin has obligations." "Mr. Pike?" "Professional matters, sir." "Miss Clara?" "She is a good daughter." "That is not what I asked." Mrs. Briar folded her hands. "Miss Clara has had to be patient." "Excellent," thought Poirot, and so did I. Thomas Reed proved more difficult. He was summoned ostensibly to discuss the movements of servants through the morning room, but Poirot quickly moved beyond such details. "You are the gardener's son," he said. "Yes, sir." "And now general attendant." "Yes, sir." "You read books." Thomas looked surprised, though not discomposed. "When I have the chance." Miss Clara lends them. It was not a question. A faint colour came into the young man's face. Sometimes. There it was, a relation of some kind, perhaps entirely innocent, perhaps merely intellectual, but certainly important. In houses where rank is rigid, the smallest crossing of its lines acquires tremendous significance. "You admire her." Thomas said nothing. "You also dislike Sir Lionel." At that he looked up sharply. "I serve Sir Lionel." "Yes," said Poirot. "That was not my question." The young man's reserve deepened. "I dislike injustice, sir." This was not the tone of a servant merely inconvenienced by discipline. It was the tone of one who has long observed the house from below and drawn moral conclusions from it. Dangerous indeed if anger joined it. When Poirot mentioned the medal, Thomas replied only, "Some people think honor belongs to objects because it is easier than keeping it in conduct." A very remarkable household, I thought. By luncheon the pattern had sharpened. The medal was not the beginning of the quarrel, only its emblem. Sir Lionel ruled by inherited memory. Clara endured him with calm that had grown into resistance. Edwin depended on him financially and therefore cultivated loud good humor to disguise apprehension. Mrs. Briar defended the house itself, perhaps more fiercely than the truth. Thomas saw too much. Julian Pike knew more than he intended to say, and through all of it ran the strained silence of old, unresolved business. That afternoon, just before Poirot asked to see Sir Lionel privately, he said to me in the hall, "The thing to remember, Hastings, is this. When an object becomes sacred in a family, it is never because the object is so important. It is because the family has placed into it whatever feeling cannot safely be spoken aloud. In this case, pride, comparison, money, gratitude demanded and not freely given. Perhaps also one older wrong. You think the medal connects to the will. I think, my friend, that in such houses everything connects to the will eventually." He was right again. One could feel it already. The tarnished silver was a message, but not an isolated one. Somebody at Ashdown Hall had chosen the family relic, not because they hated General Ashbury, but because it gave them access to what still governed the living, Sir Lionel's need to preserve old honor, and the other's growing exhaustion beneath it. What had blackened in the glass case was not merely silver, it was memory made oppressive. Chapter 3. An Old Debt in New Light. The next morning Poirot asked to see the medal case again, before anyone else in the house had begun the day's explanations. That was his way. He preferred an object in silence to a room full of theories, and I had long since learned that he trusted polished wood, dust, and misplaced trifles more than emotional declarations. The glass had not been broken. The lock showed no sign of force. Mrs. Briar, when questioned in the morning room, confirmed with stern precision that only 3 people possessed keys, Sir Lionel, herself, and Clara. Edwin Marsh declared rather too quickly that he had no interest in the object beyond ordinary family respect. Thomas Reed said he had dusted the room the previous afternoon, but had never touched the case itself. Poirot heard them all with courtesy and belief in none of them beyond the exact limits of what they said. He did not examine the medal first. Instead, he bent over the narrow polished shelf beneath the glass stand and remained there for some seconds without speaking. I saw nothing until he pointed. Upon the wood lay the faint circular mark of a ring, as though some small dish, bottle, or jar had rested there for a brief period and then been removed. The ring had been carefully wiped, but not perfectly. One edge remained duller than the rest. Poirot touched it lightly with one finger, then raised that finger and sniffed with great delicacy. "Ah," he said, "silver does not blacken by sorrow alone. Something has assisted its melancholy." Sir Lionel, who had entered halfway through this performance and plainly disliked seeing his family relic treated as a chemistry lesson, said sharply, "You mean a corrosive?" "Something of that order. Not violence, perhaps. Application," he next asked for the velvet mount inside the case to be lifted, and the medal turned slightly. On the reverse side, the tarnish was much less severe. That, too, mattered. If age alone had done this, Poirot said, the metal would have dimmed more honestly. Here the injury is selective. Someone wished the face, the visible honor, to suffer first. It was like him to make even metal psychological. Then he asked an unexpected question. "Sir Lionel, when was the medal last publicly displayed?" The old man stiffened at once, and I saw Clara, standing near the window, turn her head sharply, as if the question had struck a nerve. "Long exposed, 25 years ago," said Sir Lionel, "at a memorial dinner after my father's death." "And was that evening a happy one?" Sir Lionel gave a harsh laugh, entirely without amusement. "It ended in a quarrel. My younger brother Daniel drank too much, accused me of greed before the assembled guests, and left the house before dessert. He died a year later. There it was, the first real opening through which the past entered. Until then, the medal had seemed to belong to one of those common family dramas in which pride, inheritance, and domestic irritation gather around an object simply because it is available. But this was something more exact. The medal had been publicly displayed once before. That occasion ended in disgrace, accusation, and estrangement. Now, 25 years later, it had been prepared again for public honor and, once more, a family wound had opened around it. Poirot said nothing for a moment. Yet I knew from the stillness of his face that his interest had deepened considerably. He was never more alert than when some old injustice, supposedly buried under time and upholstery, showed signs of continuing to breathe. Later that morning, he asked to see Mr. Julian Pike, the family solicitor, in private. Pike was a man who gave away little in expression and still less in phrasing. Yet solicitors, like butlers, often reveal much by what they refuse to call significant. Under Poirot's patient questions, he admitted that the late Daniel Ashbury had died in debt, that his relations with Sir Lionel had been cold for years before the final breach, and that his widow had received from the estate nothing beyond what strict legality required. Sir Lionel fulfilled his obligations, Pike said. Ah, replied Poirot, that is often the sentence used when generosity has failed. Pike did not smile. I deal in settlements, not feelings. Unfortunately for you, said Poirot, families insist on mixing the two. By noon, another fact had emerged, and with it the whole shape of the household altered. Edwin Marsh, so jovial, so ready with his quick laugh and eager helpfulness, was Daniel Ashbury's son. Not merely a dependent cousin, then, nor some vague relation attached to the estate through convenience. He was the child of the disgraced younger brother, raised after debt, and resentment had already done their work. Suddenly, his position in the house took on a new color. His loud good humor, his excessive readiness to admire the family relic, his presence among the accounts, his watchfulness whenever Sir Lionel spoke, all of it rearranged itself in the mind. When Poirot told me this, he did so in the library with one hand lightly resting on the mantel and his eyes half closed in thought. That, Hastings, he said, is not yet the solution, but it is the shape of the injury. I knew at once what he meant. A son may inherit no money, no land, and no title, yet still inherit grievance in excellent condition. Edwin Marsh had grown to manhood beneath a story, that his father had accused Sir Lionel and gone out from the house dishonored, that his mother had received little, that the Ashbury dignity had continued without him. A medal publicly honored again after 25 years might not look to such a man like history. It might look like provocation. And you think Edwin did it? I asked. Poirot shook his head. I think Edwin has reason. But reason is abundant in families. What matters is not only who suffers an injury, but who chooses this particular language for revenge. The language of tarnish? Yes. Not theft, not destruction, disgrace visible but reversible. An insult placed exactly on the face of honor. He lifted one finger. Whoever did this wished the medal seen in its wounded state. That is, not the act of blind anger. It is the act of someone who understands ceremony. That observation stayed with me. By then, Ashdown Hall no longer seemed merely uneasy. It had become charged, as if every object in the place, letters, portraits, silver, memory itself, had begun to shift under the pressure of something long unpaid. The medal was only the first thing to blacken. The true stain, I thought, lay elsewhere and much deeper, and Poirot, having found at last the old crack in the family story, had begun to look not at the damage alone, but at the hand history had prepared to make it. Chapter 4. The missing ledger. Page events moved quickly after that. It is often so in family affairs. For years, resentment may lie folded and hidden like winter linen, and then, once one disturbing object is brought into the light, everything that has been stored near it begins to smell of the past. The Tarnished Medal had already unsettled Ashdown Hall. The missing ledger page turned unease into accusation. It happened that afternoon in the library. Sir Lionel had withdrawn there after luncheon with Julian Pike and a bundle of estate papers. Perhaps out of prudence, perhaps because old men of authority always imagine documents will behave better in their own presence. Poirot and I were in the morning room, still occupied with the medal, when the door opened abruptly, and Edwin Marsh entered with a face so animated by grievance that even before he spoke, one knew he had come not merely to report, but to force a scene. "A page has been torn from the old estate ledger," he said. "From the volume kept in Sir Lionel's desk. The missing leaf concerns payments made in the year of my father's death. Hale was not with us then, and I confess the announcement had upon me the full effect Edwin intended." Poirot, however, merely looked at him with increased attention. "You are certain?" "I found the ledger open. The page is gone, neatly gone." We followed him to the library at once. Sir Lionel stood behind the writing table, crimson with anger and struggling, visibly between outrage and contempt. Pike was beside the desk, one hand on the damaged ledger. Clara had just entered from the corridor and gone very pale. Mrs. Briar, summoned perhaps by the noise, stood near the door with a stillness so complete that it was more revealing than movement would have been. "The whole thing is theatrical." "Nonsense," Sir Lionel snapped. "Edwin rummages among my papers, finds an old account book, and declares conspiracy." But the ledger was indeed damaged. It was a large volume, calf-bound, cracked at the hinges and faintly dusty along the top edge. Somewhere near its middle, a page had been removed with considerable care. Not torn roughly, but cut close to the binding with a blade, so that only a narrow, pale stub remained. One saw at once that the act had not been impulsive. Whoever removed it knew exactly what was wanted and took the trouble to leave the rest of the book undisturbed. Pike looked troubled in the sincere, professional manner of a man who has just realized that family history is becoming active under his hands. "The missing page," he said, "would indeed have covered a portion of the estate disbursements made shortly after Mr. Daniel Ashbury left the house." "Would," said Poirot softly. "So you remember its contents?" "Only in general. I have seen the volume before." Sir Lionel gave a harsh sound. "Then perhaps you, Pike, may tell us why ancient bookkeeping should suddenly become melodrama." "Because," said Edwin, and now his voice shook with bitterness no smile could disguise, "it was in those accounts that the truth must have lain. The family honor was always reserved for one branch, while the other was left to starve. That, spoken openly, in the library, changed the atmosphere at once." Sir Lionel turned on him with such force that I half expected him to strike the desk. "You speak of what you do not know. I speak of what my mother knew very well." Clara said sharply, "Edwin, not like this." He laughed, but the sound was raw. "Not like this. The medal blackens, the accounts are mutilated, and still we must all stand properly beneath grandfather's portrait and speak as though Ashdown Hall has never done an unclean thing." Poirot raised a hand. "That will do," he said. He had not raised his voice, but the room obeyed. It is one of the extraordinary facts about Poirot that smallness of stature becomes, in moments such as these, a kind of concentrated authority. He requested then that the family leave the room one by one and speak with him separately. Sir Lionel objected. Pike hesitated. Edwin looked ready to continue his performance, but Poirot was immovable. At last they submitted. I remained with him, and at his request took notes. Clara came first. She was composed again, though only by effort. When Poirot asked whether she knew the missing page's significance, she answered honestly enough that she had long believed her father treated Daniel Ashbury unfairly in life, but did not believe him capable of cruelty without later remorse. "My father reveres justice," she said. "Many people do," said Poirot. "It is applying it at home that exhausts them." A flicker of pain crossed her face. "He regretted the quarrel," she said. "He never says so directly, but I know he did. That is not the same thing as repairing its consequences." "No," she said quietly. "It is not." Edwin came next, and with him the room seemed to sharpen. He did not shout now. The bitterness had settled into something worse. "My father was always the wasted branch," he said, "the gifted failure, the family embarrassment, the man spoken of after dinner only when the ladies were gone, and when he fell, Ashdown Hall allowed him to fall properly." "You believe Sir Lionel refused him help?" I believe help was measured out in the smallest quantity that would preserve appearances. That was very well said, and perhaps because it had been said often to himself, it sounded almost rehearsed. Poirot asked, "Why announce the missing page publicly?" Edwin met his gaze. "Because private grievances are exactly how this family survives them." Mrs. Briar denied all knowledge of the ledger. Yet when Poirot mentioned Daniel Ashbury by name, the tightening of her face told its own story. Servants, especially old retainers, often keep the moral record more faithfully than the family itself. "You remember him," said Poirot. "I remember." "The trouble," she answered. "Trouble leaves stronger marks than kindness?" "In houses, yes, sir. Thomas Reed came last. He entered with quiet respect, but not with the inward shrinking expected from his position." Poirot watched him closely. "Do you know anything of Daniel Ashbury?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "Only what village people say, sir, that he was wild, and that when he asked for help, he was turned away." "Ah," said Poirot, "village memory is a stubborn thing, more stubborn sometimes than a noble family." Thomas said nothing, yet I saw in his face the recognition of a truth long familiar. In villages, houses are judged not only by their silver and hedges, but by how they cast people out. By evening, the missing ledger page had transformed the matter. No longer was the Tarnished Medal merely a spiteful insult, it had become a signal. Someone was drawing attention, first symbolically and then materially, to an old financial grievance. Someone wanted the household to revisit the year Daniel Ashbury was cast out, and once a family is forced to reopen the year it most wishes to abbreviate, one may be certain of this: the next revelation will not be smaller than the last. Chapter 5. The Night of the Threat. That night, a storm rolled over the grounds with a deliberation almost theatrical in its timing. By dinner, the wind had begun to move heavily through the trees. By 10 o'clock, the rain struck the windows in slanting bursts, and the chimneys of Ashdown Hall had taken up that mournful, intermittent complaint which old houses reserve for weather and family disgrace. Within, the mood had altered almost as sharply as the sky. The missing ledger page had done more than disturb the household. It had changed the quality of the matter. The medal, when first tarnished, might still have been dismissed by practical minds as an act of spite aimed at Sir Lionel's vanity. The ledger page made such simplification impossible. One does not mutilate old estate accounts without intention. Numbers, dates, and missing payments carry a colder sort of accusation than damaged silver. Someone in the house was now forcing the family to look not only at honor, but at money, and at the year in which Daniel Ashbury had been cast out. Sir Lionel withdrew after dinner to his study with Mr. Julian Pike, the solicitor. Clara disappeared, for a time toward the older wing, saying she meant to consult some cabinet of family indexes. Edwin Marsh wandered from room to room with the restless brightness of a man too disturbed to sit still and too proud to admit it. Mrs. Briar increased her domestic vigilance until every servant in the place seemed to move under martial law. Thomas Reed appeared and vanished in silence, carrying coal, closing shutters, answering bells, and observing far more than his station ought to have allowed. Poirot and I remained for some while in the drawing-room. He said very little. That, with him, was always significant. When others became noisier under strain, Poirot often became quieter, as though he were giving the case room to arrange itself within his mind. At 10:30 the door opened, and Sir Lionel entered. He held a folded scrap of paper in one hand. His face was pale beneath its usual color, and though his voice when he spoke was hard enough, I saw at once that he had been genuinely shaken. "This was pushed under my study door," he said. Poirot took the paper and unfolded it upon the table. Across it, in large, clumsy capitals, had been written a single sentence: "Silver blackens. So does a name." I confess the thing had on me an immediate effect. A spoken insult can be judged by tone, a gesture by expression. But block capitals on torn paper possess a vulgar menace that is often more unsettling than eloquence. Sir Lionel asked sharply, "Do you consider that a real threat?" Poirot looked up. "It is real in this sense," he said. "It comes from a real feeling. Whether that feeling is courage or cowardice remains to be seen." We went at once to the study. The note, Sir Lionel explained, had lain just within the threshold when he rose from his desk. Pike had left him only a few minutes before. He had heard no step in the corridor and no movement outside the door. The thing had been done quickly, skillfully, and with exactly the right amount of insolence. Poirot did not waste time on the handwriting. He saw at once what I saw only after he pointed it out, that the capitals had been disguised with far too much care. A natural hand, even in haste, retains rhythm. This had none. It was a mask. "The writer does not wish to be known by the pen," Poirot said, "so we must know him by the paper." That proved much more useful. It was not family notepaper, nor was it from the study. The sheet was coarse, fibrous, and cheaply ruled on the reverse, as if torn from a working memorandum book. Under questioning, Thomas Reed admitted that a gardener's supply notebook of just such paper was kept on the table near the back corridor for seed lists, lamp oil tallies, and various household requisitions. "Yes, sir," he said. "Any of us might take a leaf from it if needed." "Any servant?" asked Hale. Thomas hesitated only long enough to remain credible. "Yes, sir, or anyone passing that way." Edwin seized on that at once. "There you are," he said. "The whole back passage is open to staff. It could have been taken by anyone." Mrs. Briar stiffened visibly at the suggestion. "The servants of this house do not threaten their master." "No," said Edwin too brightly. "Then perhaps they merely assist those who do." Sir Lionel rebuked him so sharply that he fell silent, though not, I thought, chastened. I confess I myself began then to suspect Edwin most strongly. He had motive, grievance, family bitterness, and precisely that uneasy mix of injured pride and display which often seeks satisfaction through symbolic gestures. The medal, the ledger page, and now the note, it all seemed to carry the same impulse, to force the house to look where it had refused to look before. But Poirot cautioned me when at last we found ourselves alone. "The man who is bitter is not always the man who acts," he said. "And the man who benefits from suspicion may be the one who places it." That was like him, and annoying because it was wise. The house settled only slowly after the disturbance. Sir Lionel would not retire. Pike returned briefly to him, then left. Clara did not reappear. Edwin tried twice to joke and failed both times. Mrs. Briar moved through the passages with a face of outraged rectitude. Thomas, when sent for lamps, came and went with the same composed reserve as before, though I noticed that he looked directly at the note when it lay upon the table, and with no servant's theatrical alarm. It was near midnight when there came a quiet knock at our door. Poirot called, "Come in." Clara entered. She wore a dark wrapper and carried in both hands a small packet tied with faded blue ribbon. Her face was calm, but it was the calm of a woman who has made some inward decision and now means to proceed before courage alters. "I beg pardon for the hour," she said, "but I think these concern the matter." She laid the packet on the table. "They were hidden among old nursery books in the East schoolroom. They belonged to my aunt, Daniel Ashbury's widow. I found them years ago and never spoke of them. Tonight I thought perhaps silence had become another kind of cowardice." Poirot untied the ribbon. Inside were letters, yellowed with age and worn at the folds. One, never posted, was written in a hand much firmer than I expected, and addressed to Sir Lionel. In it, Daniel's widow accused him of withholding money Daniel believed had been promised before the final quarrel. Another referred, more obliquely, to the medal affair. But when Poirot read further, he stopped and looked up. "Not this medal," he said softly. "Another." Clara nodded. "Yes. There was an earlier medal, one Daniel believed should have been sold to settle a debt or divided in value after my grandfather's death. Sir Lionel refused. He said family honor was not a commodity. My aunt wrote that honor is a convenient principle when one is not hungry." That sentence, spoken in the dim light while the storm went muttering along the house, seemed to me more accusing than the anonymous threat under the study door. Poirot read on in silence. At last he said, "Very good, mademoiselle. Very good, Miss Ashbury. Now at last we begin to see not only the grievance, but its language. For that was the essential thing. The medal in the glass case had not been chosen merely because it was visible. It had been chosen because medals already belonged to the family history of refusal, pride, and old unpaid injury. And the threat, with its line about silver and names, was no longer only menace. It was memory speaking in disguise. Chapter 6. 2 medals, 1 lie. The letters changed everything. Until that moment, the tarnished medal, the missing ledger page, and the anonymous threat might still have been interpreted as parts of a single domestic campaign of resentment. Serious, certainly, but perhaps recent in conception. Clara's packet altered the scale. It revealed not merely that Daniel Ashbury had quarrelled with his elder brother and died unreconciled, but that the quarrel itself had possessed an object, an inheritance, and a language of injury long established before the present disturbance began. According to Daniel's widow, Sir Lionel's father had left behind not 1 honoured military medal, but 2. The first, the more distinguished decoration, had gone openly and ceremonially to Sir Lionel as eldest son, together with the burden of family representation that had become almost indistinguishable from his character. The second, a lesser but still valuable campaign decoration, accompanied by a private note and linked, so the widow believed, to a modest annuity, had been intended for Daniel. After the old general's death, Daniel claimed he had received neither. That was no small grievance. In such families, objects stand in for rank, and rank for justice. To deny 1 medal may be an oversight. To deny 2, together with the expected income attached to one man's memory of paternal regard, is something closer to erasure. Poirot spread the letters across the writing table in our room and read them twice through before saying anything. The rain had passed by then, but the house retained that strained stillness which follows a storm and waits to see what has been left damaged. I watched him in silence, for I had already learned that when his stillness deepened, the case was moving from impression toward form. Julian Pike examined the papers next morning with very evident interest. He did so with the caution of a solicitor, who has spent a career protecting himself from certainty until certainty becomes unavoidable. He admitted, after several preliminary qualifications, that in those years, when he had been only a junior clerk in his uncle's practice, he had indeed heard there was confusion surrounding certain portions of the Ashbury estate papers after the old general's death. Confusion? Said Poirot mildly. Pike adjusted the spectacles upon his nose. Temporary uncertainty. There were loose memoranda, duplicate wrappers, unsigned lists. Such things are not uncommon in private family settlements. Sir Lionel, who had insisted on being present, gave a hard, impatient sound. Daniel imagined slights whenever money was involved. He was perpetually indebted, perpetually dissatisfied, and perpetually certain that someone else had cheated him. Perhaps, said Poirot, because on at least one occasion someone had. Sir Lionel turned sharply. You suggest that I stole from my own brother. I suggest nothing yet. I observe that the dead widow believed he was denied what had been intended. That belief has now been revived deliberately within this house. Pike, more uneasy than before, admitted that the matter of the second medal had certainly been mentioned in whispered family terms, though never in formal legal dispute. The annuity, too, had been expected by some, and never, so far as he knew, regularly paid. There may have been private reasons, he said. Poirot gave me one of his brief glances. When families say there was confusion, Hastings, he remarked, it often means that one person had power and another had none. That sentence, so quietly spoken, made even Sir Lionel colour. Poirot asked then to inspect the attic trunks and old document chests. This request displeased everybody except me. There are few things more invigorating than the prospect of attics in old country houses when the past has begun to misbehave. We were taken up by a narrow back stair, Mrs. Briar carrying the keys with the reluctance of a woman compelled to surrender not objects but principles. The attic ran the length of the older wing, beams blackened by age, trunks lined against the wall, campaign chests, moth-eaten banners, travelling cases, and portraits wrapped in Holland sheets. It smelled of dust, cedar, old wool, and memory. Unsuccessfully sealed. Poirot moved through it without haste, reading labels, lifting lids, and asking occasional questions in a tone so mild that resistance to it became almost absurd. In one trunk lay uniforms folded with military exactness long after use had ended. In another, dispatch boxes and framed photographs. A third held the relics of General Ashbury's public image: parade gloves, citation copies, dinner menus, memorial ribbons, and the dead paraphernalia of reverence. It was in a smaller leather case, shoved behind a campaign chest, that we found it. At first glance it appeared empty and useless, a presentation box of dark blue leather, its hinge cracked and its lining faded. But when Poirot lifted it and turned it toward the light, initials stamped faintly in worn gold became visible upon the lid: D.A. Daniel Ashbury. The box was of the right size for a medal. More curious still, inside the lid was the impressed mark of a jeweler in Bath. Poirot bent very close over it, then smiled a little. Ah, not merely a maker, a repairer. How do you know? I asked. Because there is an additional stamp beneath the name, nearly rubbed out. It indicates service. Work, clasps, fittings, cases. He paused. And often, in such establishments, purchase also. Pike, looking over his shoulder, admitted that the Bath jeweler in question had once been well known for repairing military decorations, presentation items, and, when discreetly asked, buying precious metal objects from private clients. Then, Daniel sold his medal? I exclaimed. Poirot shook his head at once. Or someone sold it for him, and if so, the money is part of the old debt. We must ask not only who was cheated, but who profited. That shifted the matter again. If Daniel truly received the medal and sold it himself in need, the grievance might remain tragic, but not criminal. If he never received it and someone else converted it into money, then the family history had been resting for 25 years upon a lie much uglier than mere neglect. The present outrage against Sir Lionel's display medal would then become not symbolic resentment alone, but accusation by echo. As we descended from the attic stairs, carrying the empty box and several associated papers, we encountered Mrs. Briar upon the landing. She had the look of a woman who had come to intercept and found herself too late. For the first time since our arrival, her composure cracked. The color had gone from her face. The hands, usually so steady, tightened visibly upon the banister rail. "Some things in this house," she said, "were better left buried." Poirot stopped and regarded her with sudden keenness. "Madame, the buried thing is precisely what has begun to smell." She flinched. It was very slight, but real. In that instant, I became certain that Mrs. Briar knew more of Daniel Ashbury's end than loyalty had ever permitted her to say. Whether she knew of theft, concealment, or merely cowardice, I could not yet tell. But the attic box had touched not only history, it had touched living memory. By the time we returned to the morning room, the case had acquired a new and far more dangerous shape. There were now two medals in the story, not one. One had survived to become a family shrine, the other had vanished into debt, secrecy, or conversion. Between them stood the broken relation of two brothers and the long authority of one man over the family narrative. And somewhere in Ashdown Hall, I felt, was a person who had finally tired of the lie by which one medal had remained sacred because the other had disappeared. Chapter 7. Mrs. Briar Speaks. The next morning Poirot summoned Mrs. Briar to the morning room and, with unusual gentleness, asked her how long she had known the truth. It was a different sort of interview from the others he had conducted in the house. With Sir Lionel, he had been exact and quietly obstinate. With Edwin, patient but sharply attentive. With Julian, Pike, polished in that dangerous fashion which compels professional men to hear how little their own caution will protect them. But with Mrs. Briar, he chose another method altogether. He did not begin with accusation. He began with age, service, and the weariness of silence. The morning room, despite its name, had by then become the chamber in which all Ashdown Hall's lies came to be reconsidered. The Tarnished Medal remained in its case near the window, looking less now like the centre of the affair than like the object chosen to announce it. Rain-washed light lay pale upon the carpet. The house was quiet in that strained way. Old houses become quiet when everyone knows that something decisive is being said elsewhere. Mrs. Briar stood by the mantel, her hands folded with habitual exactness. She was dressed in severe black, as always, and had arranged her face into the expression of dignified resistance which had served her so well through years of domestic upheaval. Yet one could see, if one watched closely enough, that resistance had become effort. The discovery in the attic had shaken her more than she wished. Poirot did not ask at once about the medal, the note, or the missing page. He asked instead, "How many years have you served this house, madame?" 20, sir, a little more. And before that? I was maid to the former mistress. So you knew Sir Lionel and Mr. Daniel when they were both younger men? Yes, sir. Then you knew the old general's household, its order, its quarrels, and the manner in which certain things were decided. Mrs. Briar's eyes moved once, briefly, toward the window where the medal stood. One learns much in service, she said. Yes, said Poirot, and one survives by saying little of it. That was the first stroke. It did not sound like pressure. It sounded like understanding, and because it sounded like understanding, it drew her nearer confession than bluntness ever could have done. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and looked not at her but at the fire, though there was no fire. Laid. How long? He asked. Have you known that Mr. Daniel Ashbury had reason to say he was robbed? Mrs. Briar did not answer at once. The silence lengthened until I thought she meant to refuse again. Then she spoke in a voice lower than before and without any defensive polish. Since the week Mr. Daniel left, I saw Poirot's head incline very slightly. Tell me. She drew breath once, as though the thing itself, not the memory of it, were being lifted. I was not housekeeper then, only maid to the old lady, but the family were in confusion after the general's death, and confusion travels. There were papers everywhere, boxes opened, lists made and remade, the clerk from the solicitor's office going in and out with his bag. Mr. Daniel had been drinking more than he should. Sir Lionel was already speaking as master. They quarrelled twice that week where others could hear, and once where they thought no one could. About the medals. About money at first. Then about what had been meant and what had not been given. Poirot turned now and regarded her fully. You heard this yourself? Enough of it. Mr. Daniel said his father had promised him something outright. Sir Lionel said promises were not documents. Mr. Daniel said the document had been seen. Sir Lionel said he lied. It was all very ugly. Was the solicitor's clerk present? Yes. The father of Mr. Julian Pike? Yes, sir. There was no pleasure in naming him. That, too, made the thing more credible. What happened afterward? Asked Poirot. Mrs. Briar's mouth tightened. Later that same day I was sent into the small study to clear the grate and set things right. I found an opened letter among the ashes, not burned fully, only thrust in and then pulled free again, as if someone had thought better of destroying it. I could not read the whole of it, only enough to know it spoke of a second decoration and of an allowance to be arranged privately. There was also a small box with Mr. Daniel's initials. The empty medal case. Yes. And did you tell anyone? Her face altered at once. Not toward shame, but toward the old hard self-defense of class and survival. Tell whom? The mistress was unwell. Sir Lionel had already taken charge of everything. Mr. Daniel had ridden out in rage. The clerk had gone. I was a servant. I could not help myself. Why keep silent? The words were out before I had properly considered them, and I regretted them almost immediately. Not because the question was wrong, but because it belonged to the easy morality of men never required to live by service. Her eyes came to me with unexpected force. Because servants do not survive by exposing masters, she said. Because if I had spoken, I should have been called liar or gossip and put out with no character. Because the young widow had a child and no means, and by then the thing had gone too far for truth to travel cleanly. Poirot said very softly, "You sent her money." Mrs. Briar stared. "How did you know that?" "Because guilt that is purely cowardly seldom gives away wages. Only conscience does that." For the first time, something like pain entered her face. "I sent her money twice," she said. "Not much, from my own savings. It was all I could do without drawing questions. She wrote back once. She said it kept them through a winter. It was not enough." Edwin then had grown up not in some vague family difficulty, not merely in the long, shabby decline that people euphemistically call bad luck, but in hardship sharpened by a wrong quietly accepted by everyone who could have, challenged it and did not. That gave his grievance not only force, but structure. One can survive misfortune. It is much harder to survive hearing, in every village whisper and every careful family omission, that your hardship might have been preventable. Mrs. Briar's confession held another sting as well. The clerk who had handled the papers, who had been present during the quarrel, who had perhaps seen the opened letter and the medal case before anyone else, was none other than Julian Pike's late father. The same firm still represented the Ashburys. The same discreet legal lineage had remained attached to the same discreet family silence. In England, institutions preserve embarrassment with remarkable continuity. Julian Pike was summoned at once. He entered with visible reluctance masked beneath professional composure. He had already, I think, guessed the direction in which the inquiry was moving. Men like Pike do not fear accusation exactly. They fear contamination by old uncertainty. Poirot spoke plainly. "Your father was clerk in the Ashbury matter when General Ashbury died." "Yes." "He was present during the dispute between Sir Lionel and Daniel." "So I have understood." "And he never afterwards raised any question about the second medal or the intended annuity." Pike's face remained composed, but the skin at the temples tightened. "My father was an honourable man." Poirot nodded. "Yes. Honourable men also make convenient silences, especially when great houses are involved." That landed with precision. Pike did not answer at once. "My father," he said carefully, "was a junior clerk. He would not have had authority to challenge family instructions unsupported by completed documents." "No," said Poirot. "Authority? No, knowledge perhaps, memory certainly." Pike looked down. He spoke once, late in life, of a difficult inheritance matter in which sentiment outran paper. He did not name Ashdown Hall. "But you knew," I suspected. That too was useful. Suspicion inherited but not acted on becomes its own kind of guilt. Still, for all the progress, one question remained unresolved and increasingly troublesome. If Edwin had the strongest claim to anger, why strike now, on the eve of a public ceremony? Why attack the medal rather than expose the documents directly? A man driven by old wrong and fresh opportunity might go straight to revelation. He might confront, accuse, or produce evidence. Instead, someone had chosen symbol, arrangement, and insinuation. Someone had staged the revival of the past in a form that was at once public and indirect. That was not Edwin's natural language. Edwin, for all his nervous brightness, was too emotionally immediate. He could act in bitterness. Yes, but this sequence, the blackened medal, the missing ledger page, the note under the door, had a colder design to it. Poirot answered the question before lunch. We were in the library. Rainlight touched the windows, and below us on the drive I could see Thomas Reed carrying in some crate or case from the potting shed. Sir Lionel had not yet joined us. Pike remained near the desk, not seated. Mrs. Briar stood farther back, exhausted now rather than defiant. Clara alone seemed prepared to hear what would come without asking mercy of it. Poirot said the purpose was not only revenge, it was arrangement. No one spoke. He continued in the same mild voice. Someone wished Sir Lionel to feel threatened. Someone wished Edwin to appear dangerous. Someone wished the past to re-emerge, but not in the form of orderly fact. The sequence has been too well staged for simple anger. First, the medal is dishonored, a symbolic insult, but reversible. Then the ledger page vanishes, suggesting old money and old concealment. Then the anonymous note is placed under the study door, using gardener's paper so that suspicion may drift downward among servants or sideways toward those who move freely in service passages. At every stage, Mr. Edwin Marsh becomes more plausible as the source, yet the proof never settles. Edwin, who had just entered unnoticed at the far end of the room, flushed with sudden fury. "You mean someone wants me blamed?" "Yes," said Poirot, "or at least usefully suspected." Sir Lionel looked at his nephew with renewed concentration, as if for the first time he had allowed himself to imagine that the grievance he had so long dismissed might make a very serviceable mask for another person's purposes. "And who," he said coldly, "would benefit from that?" Poirot spread his hands slightly. "Ah, that is the next question. Not who suffers the old wound, but who can stand behind it. Not who hates the lie, but who can use it. There are moments in a case when the room itself seems to understand before the people in it do. This was one. The history of Daniel Ashbury, the vanished second medal, the annuity never properly received, Mrs. Briar's silence, Pike's inherited discretion, all these things had become more than background. They were now the stage set. The true drama belonged to the present. Edwin's grievance was real. That was precisely what made it valuable. A false accusation built on nothing often fails at once. A suspicion built on a genuine old wound can live for days, even weeks, feeding itself on probability. Whoever had arranged the disturbances at Ashdown Hall understood that perfectly. The old debt had been brought back into the light, not merely to honor Daniel's memory or avenge him, but to create conditions under which another design might move unseen. I remember saying to Poirot afterward, when we were briefly alone in the passage, "You think Edwin innocent?" He shook his head at once. No. I think Edwin injured. There is a difference. The injured man may still lie, still conceal, still act foolishly. But the intelligence behind these gestures is not the naked intelligence of grievance. It is the intelligence that knows how grievance will be read by others. Then the second medal matters less than the use being made of it now. Exactly. History is being handled like a weapon. That means the hand is modern, even if the metal is old. Before luncheon, one further thing occurred that fixed the matter for me. As we crossed the hall, I saw Clara speak quietly to Thomas. Read near the side table. It was only a sentence or two, nothing more. Yet Mrs. Briar, watching from the farther doorway, saw it too, and looked not displeased, but alarmed. That told me the house still held some present secret connected to its old one. At Ashdown Hall, the buried thing had indeed begun to smell, and Poirot, having at last distinguished between the shape of the injury and the shape of the current design, was no longer asking only what had once been stolen from Daniel Ashbury. He was asking who, today, most needed Edwin Marsh to look like the avenger of it. Chapter 8. The hand behind the curtain Poirot had the family assemble in the drawing-room at 7 o'clock. Rain beat steadily against the long windows, and the evening had that sealed, inward quality common to country houses, when weather and human strain combine to make departure impossible in spirit even before it becomes impossible in fact. Lamps had been lit early. Their softened light fell upon the dark wood, the faded carpets, the portraits of dead Ashburys, and between the windows, the glass case containing the Tarnished Medal. It stood there like a silent witness, dishonored, conspicuous, and more eloquent now than on the day we arrived, because everyone in the room had begun to understand that it had not been chosen at random. Sir Lionel looked exhausted. The rigidity of his pride still held, but it was no longer the vigorous pride of command. It had become the pride of a man forced to sit in judgment upon a history he had long preferred to administer rather than examine. Clara sat upright and pale, her hands folded in her lap with studied quiet. Edwin's earlier anger had cooled into a wary expectancy, which was perhaps more dangerous. Anger spends itself, but expectation watches. Thomas Reed stood near the door, composed and unsmiling, his reserve now less that of a servant than of a man waiting to see whether truth will finally be permitted to enter the house. Julian Pike remained outwardly correct, but I detected for the first time a visible strain about the mouth. It was a small thing, yet with men of his type, a small thing is often the first collapse. Poirot stood with his back to the fireplace. He did not begin at once. That was deliberate. He allowed the room to feel its own silence and to grow conscious of the medal in the case. Only when no one present could any longer pretend ease did he speak. "We have," he said, "been asked to explain 3 acts. First, the tarnishing of the medal. Second, the removal of the ledger page. Third, the threatening note pushed beneath Sir Lionel's door. At first glance, these seemed to form a campaign of resentment directed from the past into the present. And naturally, the person most likely to be suspected was Mr. Edwin Marsh. Edwin's face tightened, but he said nothing. That suspicion, continued Poirot, was not foolish. Mr. Marsh had cause for grievance. His father, Daniel Ashbury, was treated with injustice, or at the very least with a coldness so severe. That injustice flourished easily beside it. He grew up under the knowledge that another branch of the family retained honor, position, and security, while his own did not. Such a history makes anger very natural. Sir Lionel moved impatiently. "Then, you accuse him after all?" "No," said Poirot. "I dismiss him as the author of the whole scheme." That produced the first real stir in the room. Edwin looked startled. Clara turned her head quickly. Pike did not move, but the hand resting on the arm of the chair altered its position. Poirot went on. "Mr. Edwin Marsh did indeed search for evidence of his father's mistreatment. He did indeed examine old estate papers. That much is true. In desperation, perhaps, and certainly with bitterness, he looked for proof that Daniel Ashbury had been denied what was intended to him. But he did not tarnish the medal. He did not write the anonymous note. His grievance is real. His methods are not subtle enough." Edwin flushed darkly. "That sounds less like absolution than insult," Poirot inclined his head. "Truth is rarely polite." He turned then, quite unexpectedly, toward Thomas Reed. The young man did not start, but I saw his shoulders draw a fraction more squarely back. "It is here," said Poirot, "that we require another fact. Mr. Thomas Reed has not always served, only in the house and garden. Before returning permanently to Ashdown Hall, he worked for a period in Bath, part-time, for a dealer in silver, military relics, and old presentation pieces." Thomas said quietly, "Yes." Sir Lionel stared. "Why was that never mentioned?" Thomas replied. "Because no one asked, sir. A dangerous answer in another house. In this one, it passed because the entire room had already shifted beyond ordinary discipline." "It was Thomas," Poirot continued, "who recognized the jeweller's mark inside Daniel Ashbury's empty medal box when we found it in the attic. He did not announce the fact immediately. Instead, and very intelligently, he wrote privately to inquire whether any record survived of the box and its contents. Now Pike's color changed, only slightly, but enough. The reply, said Poirot, arrived 2 days before our visit. It stated that the second medal had indeed passed through that Bath establishment many years ago, but not from Daniel Ashbury himself. All eyes turned, almost as one, toward Julian Pike. "The medal," said Poirot, "was sold by a representative from the Ashbury legal office." For a second no one spoke. The rain seemed to increase, though perhaps that was only my own sudden sense of sound. Julian Pike gave a small dry cough and adjusted his cuffs with fingers that were no longer entirely steady. "This proves nothing against me," he said. "If such a transaction took place, it was my father's doing. I was a child." Poirot did not contradict him directly. That was part of his cruelty when he chose to use it. "Yes," he said. "Your father handled the matter. Your father, not you, converted the second medal into money. Your father, not you, allowed confusion in the estate papers to become profitable. Your father, not you, preserved silence while Daniel Ashbury was left to believe himself robbed, and indeed was. Robbed. All this is true. Pike drew breath as if relieved. And yet, Poirot added, it is also true that you discovered it. The relief vanished. There it was, the true movement of the case. Poirot paced once, very slowly, before the fireplace. Among the older files of the practice there remained fragments, notes, memoranda, perhaps a copied receipt, enough to show that the sale of Daniel's medal had covered not Daniel's debts, but private liabilities connected to the legal office. Your father profited, or at least relieved his own pressure, by converting property that was not his to sell. For years the matter slept. Then Miss Clara Ashbury, in preparing the family donation and reviewing the archive arrangements after the ceremony, made known her intention to go more thoroughly through the estate records. Clara looked up. Yes, I did. You did so. Openly, said Poirot, quite innocently. But to Mr. Pike it was not innocent, it was catastrophic. For if the old fraud emerged now, it would not merely stain Ashdown Hall. It would ruin the reputation of his father, his own inherited practice, and the decent legal continuity on which such men live. Sir Lionel said hoarsely, Then why not destroy the files and be done with it? Because, said Poirot, destruction alone points inward. A missing paper may raise suspicion, but an entire sequence of symbolic disturbances can create a more useful narrative. Mr. Pike needed the past to re-emerge, yes, but under his management. Pike opened his mouth, but Poirot overrode him. You blackened the Ashbury medal in order to revive the old quarrel in symbolic form. You chose that object because it would direct everyone's mind not to a clerk's theft, but to family grievance and wounded inheritance. Then you removed the ledger page, most likely to draw attention toward the legal office's handling of the accounts. Lastly, you wrote the threatening note upon Gardner's paper so that suspicion might drift downward toward Thomas Reed, or sideways toward Edwin Marsh, both men already placed by station and history to look plausible. Thomas did not move, but Edwin gave a sudden exclamation of pure disgust. You meant us to tear at each other while you sat and advised. Pike's control broke at last. It was my father, he said. Do you hear? My father took the money. My father made the arrangement. What was I to do? Publish it in the county paper? Ruin a name already in my keeping? Destroy the firm for a theft committed before I had a voice in it? Poirot's face altered then. It became very hard. No. Monsieur, he said, you meant to direct scandal away from yourself. Pike stared at him, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw the man beneath the solicitor, not merely cautious, but frightened. I only meant, he said more weakly, to prevent disgrace. Disgrace, said Poirot, had already taken place long ago. What you wished to prevent was its correct address. That was decisive. Sir Lionel sank back into his chair, as if some inward framework had given way. He looked not at Pike, but at the medal in the glass case. All these years, he said, Daniel thought I cheated him. Poirot answered carefully. You did not correct what was done. No. It came out like a confession dragged through old pride. No. Clara spoke then, and her voice was steadier than any other in the room. That is why the medal was chosen. Not only because of Daniel, because it let the wrong seem to belong to the family and not the office. Yes, said Poirot, exactly. The hand behind the curtain was not the hand most injured by the past. It was the hand most threatened by the orderly return of it, Thomas said quietly. Then the note was never meant to warn Sir Lionel. No, said Poirot. It was meant to make him afraid in a direction useful to Mr. Pike. Edwin laughed. Conce harshly. You nearly had us all doing your work for you. Pike turned on him with sudden bitterness. And you were delighted to look dangerous. That, said Poirot, is enough. The rain beat harder against the windows for a moment, then lessened again. No one seemed to breathe quite naturally. At last, Sir Lionel said, without looking, Up, leave us, Pike. The solicitor did not move immediately. You understand, he said, in a voice grown dull with collapse, that if this becomes public, the Ashbury name is not the only one affected. Sir Lionel lifted his head then, and something of the old military force returned, though altered now by shame. "The Ashbury name," he said, "has survived worse than solicitors." Pike went out without another word. When the door closed, Poirot stood for some seconds in silence. The case, as a matter of deduction, was finished. But deduction and moral consequence are not the same. This was one of those endings in which revelation restored truth without restoring innocence. Sir Lionel had not sold the second medal, but he had allowed Daniel to go out under suspicion and grievance never properly answered. Pike's father had stolen, but Sir Lionel's pride had made the theft easier to bury. Edwin had lived under the shadow of a half-known injustice. Thomas had seen enough to question what honor meant in such a house. Clara had moved among relics and papers, while the true contamination remained not in the metal, but in the memory curated around it. The medal in the case had blackened, but the lie, I thought, had blackened first. Chapter 9. The Weight of Inheritance. Confession. When it came, brought not relief, but a more searching misery. That is the defect in those dramatic scenes by which the public imagines justice is achieved. One expects revelation to clear the air, to strike chains from the innocent, to humble the guilty, and to restore the moral weather of the room. In reality, truth often does something much less agreeable. It strips away convenience. It leaves grief where vanity has stood, and shame where indignation once flourished. It restores proportion, yes, but not comfort. Julian Pike admitted it at last. He did so not nobly, and not all at once, but in the weary, reduced tone of a man who sees that denial would now only cheapen what little dignity remains available. To him. His father, he said, had indeed withheld the papers relating to Daniel Ashbury's annuity. The second medal, intended as part of a private paternal provision and carrying its own symbolic as well as financial weight, had been sold quietly through the Bath jeweller, whose mark we found in the attic box. The money had not gone to Daniel. It had been used, as Poirot had suspected, to relieve obligations closer to the legal office than to the Ashbury family. There had been debts, temporary pressures, a need for discretion, and a calculation that Daniel, already mistrusted in his habits and careless in reputation, would make the easier loser. So my father told himself, Pike said, staring not at any of us but at the floor between his shoes. It was only until matters steadied, only until the annuity papers could be regularized, only until the old general's effects were properly sorted. But temporary dishonesty acquires permanence. Very quickly when no one profits by correcting it. Poirot did not interrupt. That, with him, is often the greatest severity. Sir Lionel, though not the architect of the theft, had chosen not to pursue Daniel's accusations seriously. That also came into the light, and if it was not criminal, it was in some respects worse. A theft may be the act of one corrupt hand. A refusal to investigate, when one has both power and reason to do so, is a moral failure diffused across years. Sir Lionel had preferred family dignity to uncomfortable truth. He had judged his younger brother unstable, indebted, emotional, and therefore less trustworthy than appearances he himself found easier to maintain. Daniel, discredited and desperate, had gone out from Ashdown Hall not merely angry, but progressively broken. He died believing himself betrayed by blood and law alike. That knowledge settled over the drawing room, not like drama, but like weight. The rain still tapped at the windows. The medal in the glass case stood between the curtains, darkened now, beyond any possibility of being mistaken for simple neglect. The lamps lit faces rather than softened them. I remember thinking that the room had lost whatever remained of domestic illusion. It was no longer a drawing room. It was a courtroom after the verdict, when those acquitted and condemned alike still remain seated because no one has yet remembered how ordinary movement is resumed. Edwin Marsh listened without triumph. That struck me more than anything else. For years, I had no doubt, he had lived with some inward fantasy of vindication. of the day when the Ashburys would be made to hear aloud what had been done to Daniel, when the balance of inherited humiliation might be corrected by the simple public admission of it. Yet when the admission came, it did not restore his father, nor quiet the bitterness of his own upbringing, nor grant him that fierce compensatory satisfaction upon which injured families often feed in imagination. A man may hunger long for justice, and find when it arrives that justice has very little nourishment in it. His face, as Pike spoke, altered several times, once toward anger, once toward disgust, once, most unexpectedly, toward pity. But triumph never appeared. At last he said, in a voice much quieter than I had yet heard from him, "So all those years it was true. And he died, not mad, not drunk. On grievance but right," no one answered. Clara, seated a little apart near the fire, had not wept openly until then. She had preserved throughout the earlier scene that admirable and dangerous self-command which belongs to women accustomed to surviving authority by not exposing their own wounds to it. But now, as the full shape of Daniel's end emerged, not merely loss, but discredit attached to real injury, I saw tears gather and then fall silently. She turned her face away, perhaps in shame at showing them before her father, perhaps because some part of the family's long falsehood had been hers too, simply by inheritance of silence. Sir Lionel sat bowed in his chair, staring at the tarnished silver as if he saw in it not metal, not even insult, but his own failure preserved in visible form. The thing had blackened under the hand of Pike, yes, but beneath Pike's act lay Sir Lionel's older cowardice, and it was that, I think, which he beheld at last. He said after some time, "I did not believe him." No one moved. He had lied before, borrowed, excused, dramatized, pleaded. One grows tired of a man's emergencies when they come too often. He stopped, pressed one hand against the arm of the chair, and went on more harshly. I told myself that was all this was. Another grievance, another demand, another scene. I preferred that explanation because it required less of me. Poirot said quietly, "Yes. There is no cruelty sharper than simple agreement when a person has at last judged himself accurately." Then Thomas Reed spoke. It was unexpected enough that all turned toward him at once. Until then, he had remained near. The door very still, his reserve serving him as it always had in the house, like a coat not easily stripped away. But now he stepped a little forward, not as a servant asking leave, but as a man who has finally understood that continued silence would itself become a distortion. "Daniel's widow," he said, "was my grandmother's cousin." The statement landed with extraordinary force precisely because it had never been suspected in that form. Ashdown Hall, like many houses of its order, had always imagined village memory as something vague and inferior, gossip carried in cottages, fragments, embroidery, sentiment without document. It had not imagined that memory might persist in family lines parallel to its own, dignified by poverty if not by silver. Thomas went on. I grew up hearing parts of the story, not the legal details, not the jeweler, or the annuity, or the clerk, but the feeling of it, that Daniel had gone out believing he was cheated, that his wife had written letters never answered, and that what happened at the Hall was never spoken of by the Hall again. Sir Lionel looked at him fully for the first time since our arrival, not as master to servant, but as one man unexpectedly discovering another's place in the narrative. "You came here for that reason?" Thomas hesitated only long enough to remain honest. At first, yes, not for revenge, to see whether anything still existed that might prove the old story was not merely bitterness made into legend. Edwin said sharply, "And you told no one?" Thomas turned his head. "Would you have thanked me if I had arrived in the yard announcing that your father's ruin was a family theft, half forgotten by everyone who mattered?" Edwin did not answer. Thomas then did something that interested Poirot greatly. He looked not at Edwin, nor at Sir Lionel, but at Clara. "It was I," he said, "who encouraged Miss Clara's interest in the older papers, not by deception, only by telling her that if the Hall's history were to be arranged for public honor, it ought first to be read honestly." Clara gave a small involuntary movement. "Why did you not tell me more?" "Because I did not know more," he said simply. "Only that decency sometimes succeeds where accusation does not." Poirot inclined his head. "You chose patience over malice," he said. "That was wise. Yet you see how close the house came to making you the villain simply because you carried old memory." Thomas answered, "Yes." That quiet yes, I thought, contained more knowledge of Ashdown Hall than many louder speeches, for that was precisely the danger which had lain in Pike's scheme. He had not merely sought to avert scrutiny from his father's office and his own inheritance of disgrace. He had arranged matters so that the burden of plausible guilt might settle upon the two men in the house best fitted by history and class to bear it. Edwin, the son of the wronged branch, openly bitter and therefore useful. Or Thomas, the intelligent servant connected by village memory to the old wrong and therefore equally serviceable if the house wished to look downward rather than inward. It was a most English arrangement of blame. Family above stairs, suspicion distributed below and sideways. Sir Lionel struggled to his feet then. It was not easy to watch. Hate and pride, once combined, make even standing resemble conflict. But he rose and, after a moment in which I thought he might not master either his body or his words, turned to Edwin Marsh. "I cannot restore your father's life," he said, hoarsely, "but I can acknowledge before all present that he was wronged, and what was withheld shall be repaid." It was not an eloquent speech. It contained none of the graceful turns by which men of feeling or public habit ennoble repentance. Yet because it had cost him so much pride, it possessed a grim honesty that eloquence might only have weakened. He had not merely admitted error. He had admitted that his authority, so long used to preserve the family image, had in this case served cowardice. Edwin looked at him for a long moment. "Repaid to whom?" he asked. Sir Lionel gave the faintest wince, because the question was, "Just to those who bore it after him, to you where money can do that much, to the record where money cannot." Again, not elegant, but true. Edwin's face worked strangely then. For one instant, I thought he might refuse, or strike back with some phrase stored through years of bitterness. Instead he said, low and almost wonderingly, "He used to say that one day they would admit it, but he also said it would be too late to matter." Poirot said, "It is too late to heal the original wound. It is not too late to cease lying about it." That, I think, was the nearest thing to consolation the evening could honestly provide. Julian Pike, who had by then sunk into a chair with the reduced and almost stunned look of a man seeing the whole architecture of his caution collapse around him, said nothing. There was no point now. His part in the present campaign had been exposed, his father's in the older fraud effectively established, and whatever sympathy might once have existed for his burden as son had been exhausted by the malice of his method. If he had simply confessed the old office papers, he might have been pitied. By blackening the medal, tearing the ledger page, and directing suspicion toward others, he made himself something colder than merely compromised. He made himself an arranger of other people's guilt for personal preservation. Clara had ceased, weeping by then, though the traces remained. She rose after a time and went to the glass case. For a moment I thought she meant to open it, but she did not. She merely stood looking at the medal. "It is strange," she said softly, more to herself than to the room, "how quickly an object changes when the story around it changes." Poirot answered from behind her, "No, not quickly. The object was always the same. It is only the eye that becomes honest." That was precisely it. The medal, still blackened in its case, seemed to have acquired a new meaning. It was no longer the emblem of noble history alone, no longer merely the handsome, public remnant of General Ashbury's bravery and Sir Lionel's filial worship. It had become proof that reputation, polished for display, may conceal decay beneath. Worse than that, it had become evidence that what is publicly revered is often used privately to silence the less convenient members of a family. The symbol, in other words, had turned witness. As the evening wore on and the room slowly relaxed from revelation into aftermath, smaller truths emerged in their wake. Mrs. Briar, who had sent money from her own wages to Daniel's widow, sat more heavily than before, as if the burden of concealed knowledge once spoken had at last revealed itself as weight. Julian Pike asked in a dull voice whether the letters and the empty box would now be handed to authorities or merely retained within the family record. Sir Lionel answered that they would be entered formally, which I took to mean that for once he understood that secrecy itself had been the true accomplice. Thomas withdrew again to the edge of the room, though now no one present, not even Sir Lionel, looked at him quite as they had earlier. He had come into Ashdown Hall as a servant, with a dangerous surplus of intelligence. He remained in it for the moment as the bearer of a moral continuity the family had almost lost. It was Poirot who ended the evening, not with flourish, not with one of those triumphal summings up in which lesser detectives delight. He simply crossed to the glass case, looked once more at the tarnished face of the medal, and said, "One should remember this. The dead do not always rule the living by their virtues. Sometimes they rule them by the false uses to which their virtues are put." No one answered him. There was nothing to say. The rain had eased to a faint, steady whisper. Somewhere in the house a clock began to strike the quarter. The room, though still full of people, felt suddenly very large and very old. I thought then that the weight of inheritance is not merely land, money, portraits, or old silver. It is the moral pressure of unfinished acts passed forward under the disguise of continuity. Daniel Ashbury had left behind debt, yes, and grievance. But Sir Lionel had left behind something as grave, the choice not to know too clearly. Pike's father left theft. Pike himself left manipulation. Edwin inherited anger. Thomas inherited memory. Clara inherited the burden of looking honestly, where the house had long preferred to arrange honor instead. And the medal, blackened deliberately to awaken all this, stood between them still, saying at last what no public ceremony ever could. That history is easiest to display at the precise moment it becomes hardest to bear. Chapter 10. Silver Restored. The ceremony took place 3 days later, though in altered form. The interval had been necessary not only for practical arrangements, but for the slower and more difficult work by which a house, once forced to hear the truth aloud, begins to discover whether it means merely to survive it or to answer it. At Ashdown Hall, survival would have been easy. The old formulas stood ready to assist. Silence, discretion, charitable euphemism, the careful trimming of unpleasant facts into phrases suitable for county ears. It would have been the simplest thing in the world for Sir Lionel Ashbury to announce an indisposition, postpone the historical gathering, have the medal privately cleaned to a blameless brightness, and allow Daniel's name to sink once more beneath the thicker sediment of family convenience. That he did not do so was, in its way, the final and most difficult act of the case. He did not become a transformed man. People rarely do. He did not suddenly soften into a patriarch of generous sentiment, nor did he produce eloquence from remorse. Sir Lionel remained austere, proud, and visibly uncomfortable beneath the burden of his own public duty. Yet he did what prideful men find hardest. He accepted correction not merely in private, but before witnesses. The local historical society still gathered on the appointed afternoon. The weather had turned colourless and cold, with a pale light over the lawns and a thin wind moving the last leaves against the terrace steps. Motorcars arrived in the drive. Ladies in hats and gentlemen with county faces and damp gloves were shown in by Finch, whose expression suggested that history, though regrettable, would at least be properly ushered. The drawing-room and morning-room had been opened together for the occasion, chairs arranged, tea prepared, catalogues laid out, and the family relics placed for inspection with far greater modesty than originally intended. The medal remained in its glass case, but it did not gleam as Sir Lionel had first meant it to gleam. At Poirot's suggestion, only enough of the tarnish had been removed to prevent permanent damage. The blackened patches had been carefully softened, the worst corrosive stain arrested, the engraved crest made legible again. Yet a shadow remained upon the silver, not as neglect, but as memory. When I remarked upon it before the guests arrived, Poirot said, "Let it keep a little darkness, Hastings. It is useful that people remember silver may corrode." The room itself seemed altered by that decision. Had the medal been restored to perfect brightness, the ceremony might still have pretended toward triumph. As it stood, the object refused false innocence. It shone, yes, but not with the polished self-righteousness of a relic scrubbed clean of history. It had become something better and more honest, an honored thing touched by human failing. The members of the Historical Society, I need hardly say, sensed from the first that the program before them was not quite the one they had expected. Mr. Julian Pike's absence alone would have stirred comment, had there not already circulated. In the county, that particular form of informed uncertainty by which country neighborhoods understand much more than they publicly claim. Mrs. Briar received several ladies with the grave dignity of a woman who had resolved, after long inward conflict, to outlast not only gossip but conscience. Clara moved among the guests with quiet competence and an ease I had not yet seen in her. Edwin stood somewhat apart at first, plainly uncertain how far his new position in the story permitted him to occupy the room. Thomas Reed did not appear before the company except in service, yet even there I noticed a subtle change. Finch addressed him once by name, and not, as formerly, only by instruction. At 4 o'clock precisely, Sir Lionel spoke. He stood beside the case, one hand resting lightly upon its edge, and for a moment I thought he might not manage it. Public feeling did not come naturally to him unless it wore the shape of command. What he had to say now required something more difficult than command. It required admission. He began briefly and almost stiffly with his father. General Sir Matthew Ashbury's service, the campaign at Kandar Ridge, the official commendation, the family pride naturally attached to such distinction, these he mentioned, with exactness and no flourishes. But then he paused, and every person in the room felt the change before he named it. There is, he said, another duty attached to family remembrance, and it is not always a comfortable one. No one moved. For year. Too many years, he went on, the Ashbury record has honored one branch of service and omitted another branch of suffering. My younger brother, Daniel Ashbury, has not been named in family accounts as he should have been. Wrong was done to him in the settlement of certain personal matters after my father's death. That wrong was not adequately corrected. It is proper that his name should be restored to memory and that the neglect attached to it should not survive us. It was not an eloquent speech. There were hesitations, there was strain. One heard the labor in it. Yet precisely because it had cost him so much, it carried a force no graceful public sentence could have had. The room, full of county people accustomed to polished surfaces, felt suddenly attentive in a deeper and less social way. Sir Lionel then announced the establishment of a charitable fund in Daniel Ashbury's memory to be administered locally, and connected with training and support for young men of limited means from the district. A practical choice, Clara later told me, because Daniel had repeatedly been called promising in youth and wasted in maturity, and she would not have his name tied to pity when usefulness could be made from it instead. Sir Lionel further acknowledged Edwin Marsh publicly as the rightful descendant of the neglected branch and stated, with a dryness that was almost moving in its honesty, that certain financial settlements, long delayed, would now be corrected. The effect upon Edwin was remarkable in its restraint. He did not look gratified. He did not stand taller, nor adopt the expression of a man suddenly elevated by justice. If anything, he seemed subdued, almost bewildered by the insufficiency of public redress to answer private inheritance. I was reminded again of Poirot's observation that vindication arrives too late to repair what shapes a life. Yet something in Edwin's face eased all the same, not healed. That would be sentimental nonsense. But eased, as if one long inner argument had at last lost the power to repeat itself unchecked. The Historical Society, having come for heroism and antiquarian pleasure, received instead a demonstration more English and more useful, the public amendment of family memory under social witness. It impressed them, I think, more than any speech about medals could have done. They moved afterward through the displayed letters and photographs with a caution that bordered on respect. The medal, darkened still in places, drew more attention than it would ever have drawn at its original brightness. People looked at it longer. They read the cards more carefully. Several spoke quietly with Clara. One elderly colonel, moustached and red-eyed with the earnestness of old service clubs, told Sir Lionel that candour was a bloody uncommon thing, and therefore to his credit. Sir Lionel received that with a bow so slight that only Poirot and I, watching him closely, could see how much it meant. Julian Pike had by then already resigned his position. He did not attend the ceremony. Nor, I think, could he have borne it. He had withdrawn to London the previous day after placing in writing the facts of the old sale so far as his father's files and memory allowed. Whether he would face criminal consequences depended upon matters beyond our immediate concern: time, records, statutes, the practical reach of law into inherited wrongdoing. But his reputation and the easy continuity of his professional inheritance had already suffered what mattered most. The Ashburys would no longer be clients. The county would know enough. And for a man of Pike's type, whose life had been built on discreet reliability, public uncertainty was punishment of a peculiarly intimate kind. Mrs. Briar, though much shaken by all that had been unearthed, seemed lighter afterwards. I do not mean happier. That would be too easy, and perhaps too much to expect from old women who have carried silence as a duty for decades. But something in her manner had unfastened. She moved less rigidly. Her face, while still stern, no longer held that inner tightening. I had first noticed whenever Daniel's name approached being spoken. It was as though 20 years of self-excusing silence had at last been set down, not forgiven perhaps, but no longer constantly carried. She came to Poirot once after the last of the guests had gone into the dining room for tea, and said with a bluntness I admired, "I ought to have spoken sooner." Poirot answered, "Yes." She nodded, neither offended nor relieved by the agreement. "But if I had spoken then," she said, "I should have been turned out and the thing denied." Also true. Then what is a woman to do with such truth? Poirot considered her very gravely before replying. "She keeps it, madam, until there is at last a chance it may be heard. You made one wrong choice long ago. That does not make this one useless." Mrs. Briar accepted that with the dignity of a woman to whom sentiment would have been an insult. As for Clara, I thought then, and think still, that she would prove the steadier guardian of Ashdown Hall than any man who had ruled it through wounded vanity. She had no love of shrine-making, no appetite for public legend, and no patience with the domestic mythologies by which powerful fathers excuse themselves. More importantly, she possessed that rare combination of intelligence and moral endurance by which old houses are most humanely preserved, not by reverence alone, not by rebellion alone, but by the willingness to know what happened within them and refuse thereafter to varnish it into something prettier than truth. I said as much to Poirot when we found ourselves standing together, near the window after the society had dispersed, and the family, at last exhausted by honesty, had retreated into separate rooms. He adjusted with immense precision the crease in his sleeve before answering. "Yes," he said. "Miss Clara understands that inheritance is not only silver and land, but narrative. That is why she may yet save the house from becoming a museum of its own excuses." We stood then in companionable silence. The medal in its case caught the grey afternoon light, and I looked at it with altered eyes. It shone, yes, but not perfectly. A slight shadow remained along the lower edge and about the crest where the worst staining had been. 3 days earlier, that imperfection would have looked to the house like humiliation. Now it seemed to me exactly right. "Would you not have preferred it wholly restored?" I asked. Poirot shook his head. "Perfect brightness, Hastings, is sometimes the least trustworthy thing in the world. Men polish objects to reassure themselves that history may be made decorative. But a little darkness, that is often the beginning of wisdom." Then he said the thing that, for me, completed the case. You see, the little object in the glass case was never the real mystery. The mystery was this: who profits when memory is allowed to corrode? I looked again at the medal, and beyond, Hit at the long wet lawn, the clipped yews, and the pale sky pressing close to the windows of Ashdown Hall. Who profits? Not always the one who hates the past most loudly. Not always the one most visibly injured by it. Sometimes the profit lies with the person who can live comfortably so long as old confusion remains uncorrected. Sometimes it belongs to institutions, to habits, to professional silences, to the laziness of family pride. Sometimes, as at Ashdown Hall, an entire household profits a little from not asking too sharply where honor ends and convenience begins. The case had begun with silver blackened. In a locked case, it ended with something far more difficult restored: proportion. General Ashbury's bravery remained real. Daniel's grievance remained real. Sir Lionel's failure was real. Pike's inherited fraud was real. Edwin's bitterness, Thomas's patience, Clara's steadiness, Mrs. Briar's delayed conscience, all were real. And because they were real together, the family legend that had once simplified the house into honor on one side and weakness on the other could no longer stand. The medal had been cleaned enough to survive, but not enough to lie. It seems to me now that this was the justest possible ending, for perhaps perfect brightness is not what honest relics deserve. Perhaps they deserve, rather, to bear a trace of what they have passed through, so that the living may not be tempted to admire them without also remembering the hands, faithful, greedy, cowardly, patient, or ashamed, through which they came. Poirot, having delivered one more household from the stupidity of its arrangements, picked up his hat, inspected the brim for imaginary dust, and said, "Come, Hastings, we leave. Them now with the most uncomfortable of all possessions." "What is that?" "The truth," he replied. "It is very difficult to keep polished."
Thanks for you watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe the Pretell channels.